The FBI agents who opened that basement door were not prepared for what they found. They had come to settle an estate, a formality. A 79-year-old janitor had died alone in his house in Dayton, Ohio, with no next of kin listed and no will on file. Standard procedure said someone had to clear the property. They had knocked as a courtesy. Nobody answered because nobody was left to answer. The house was small, worn but clean, everything in its place. Then one of the agents found the door behind the furnace. What was behind it took 3 days to fully document. And by the end of those 3 days, 2 special agents who had been with the FBI for a combined 31 years were sitting in a parking lot outside that house in silence because neither of them knew what to say first. His name was Eugene Marr. He had worked as a janitor at Jefferson Middle School in Dayton for 38 years. He arrived at 6 a.m. every morning and left at 4 p.m. every afternoon. He knew every teacher's name, every room's particular problem, which hallway light flickered when it was cold, which bathroom drain ran slow in winter. He fixed things before anyone noticed they were broken. He wished people good morning and meant it. He brought donuts on the last Friday of every month and left them in the staff room without signing the box. For 38 years, nobody asked him much about himself. He did not seem to mind. The children called him Mr. Gene. He remembered their names. All of them every year, the whole school. Teachers who had worked there for 20 years could not do what he did with names. He just remembered. If a kid was having a bad day, he seemed to know before the kid did. He would find a reason to be fixing something nearby. He would not say much. He would just be there. Several of those children, now adults with children of their own, would later say that Mr. Gene had been the steadiest presence in their entire school experience. Not a teacher, not a counselor, just a man with a mop who saw them. He retired in 2016 at the age of 72. The school held a small party in the gymnasium. The principal gave a speech. Some of the older teachers cried. Eugene thanked everyone quietly and shook every hand, and the next morning he was gone. He died 3 years later in the house he had lived in for 41 years. The cause was heart failure. He was found by a neighbor who had noticed his mail piling up. At his death, Eugene Marr owned the following: Ford pickup truck with 190,000 miles on it, a house valued at 94,000, a savings account with 4,200 in it, a closet full of work clothes, all of it clean and folded with the kind of precision that belongs to people who were trained by institutions that take precision seriously. And the basement. What the Marine Corps does to a person is not simple to explain to someone who has not been through it. It does not just train your body. It trains your attention. It trains you to notice what other people walk past, to see the thing that is slightly wrong in a scene that looks completely normal, to hold information quietly and act on it with patience rather than urgency, to understand that the most dangerous situations are often the ones that look the most ordinary. Eugene Marr had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1962 at the age of 18. He grew up in a small house in Kettering, Ohio, the only child of a machinist father and a mother who worked the register at a hardware store. He was a quiet kid. His teachers described him, in the few records that still existed, as attentive. That word appeared more than once. Not brilliant, not troubled, attentive. He noticed things. He remembered what he noticed. He served for 6 years. He did 2 tours in Vietnam beginning in 1965. He was a scout sniper, which is one of the most demanding and selective roles in the entire American military. The selection rate for scout sniper school in the 1960s was somewhere below 30%, and the men who washed out were not weak men. They were simply not patient enough, or not precise enough, or not capable of the particular kind of stillness that the role requires. Scout snipers do not simply shoot, they observe. They study patterns over days and sometimes weeks. They learn to read environments the way other people read faces. They are trained to be invisible and unhurried and exact in a way that takes years to build and never fully leaves a person once it is in them. Eugene came home in 1968 to a country that was tearing itself apart over the war he had just finished fighting. He had a Purple Heart. He had a combat action ribbon. He had the kind of eyes that had learned to hold things quietly. He did not march against the warly. He did not defend it loudly in bars. He got a job maintaining grounds at a public park. He found the house on Milford Street, a two-bedroom place with a porch that needed paint and a yard that needed work, and he bought it for 18 Zalozen and fixed the porch himself over one long weekend. He planted tomatoes in the backyard every spring for the next 41 years. He never married. He had a brother in Cincinnati he spoke to on the phone every few weeks. He went to church on Sunday at a Methodist congregation 3 blocks from his house. He was not a man who took up a lot of space in a room. He was not a man who needed to. What nobody knew for 40 years was that he had never stopped working. The basement was 16 feet by 20 feet. The agents who documented it later said it felt larger than it was because of how it was organized. Every wall had shelving. Every shelf was labeled. Every item on every shelf was in a protective sleeve or a sealed folder or an archival box. There were 47 case files. Each one was a cold case, an unsolved crime from Dayton and the surrounding counties going back to 1971. Missing persons, unsolved homicides, disappearances that had gone nowhere. Cases that had been filed and forgotten and left to age in police storage. Eugene had worked every single one of them. The files were not thin. The average file was 60 to 80 pages. They contained photographs, hand-drawn maps, handwritten timelines, cross-referenced witness lists, newspaper clippings with annotations in the margins, physical evidence samples in sealed bags, and in many cases a final section Eugene had labeled simply conclusions, written in the same clear, unhurried handwriting that appeared in every document in that basement. He had solved 14 of them. Not suspected, not theorized, solved. With evidence sufficient, in the judgment of the FBI agents who reviewed his work, to support prosecution. The first thing Agent Diane Kowalski said, when she finished reading the 14th file, was that this man had done better work than half the detectives she had worked with in her career, and he had done it alone in a basement in Dayton, with no badge, no database access, no forensic lab, and no authority. The second thing she said was that they needed to find out how. What they found when they looked was a picture of a man who had been paying attention every day for 40 years. Eugene had begun the first file in 1971. A 9-year-old girl named Sylvia Crane had disappeared from her neighborhood 3 blocks from the school where Eugene would later work. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. She had walked home from school the same route she always walked. She never arrived. The police searched for 2 weeks. They found nothing. The case went cold in 1973. Eugene had been living in Dayton for 3 years at that point. He read about Sylvia in the paper the week she disappeared. He read every follow-up article. He cut them all out and put them in a folder. He was not sure at that point what he intended to do with them. He only knew that something in him could not set the folder down. He started walking the neighborhood, not officially, not with any kind of authority. He was a man who lived nearby and walked his streets and talked to people the way neighbors talk to each other. He had a face that was easy to trust, something about the steadiness of him, the way he listened without the particular urgency that makes people feel interviewed rather than heard. He talked to a woman who ran a small grocery on the corner. He talked to a retired postal worker who had been on that route for 20 years. He talked to children who had known Sylvia carefully. The way you talk to children when you understand that they hold things they do not know they are holding. And he talked to Harold Prout. Harold was 71 years old and lived alone in a house on the far end of the block. He had not spoken to the police because nobody had come to his door. He was not the kind of man who inserted himself into official matters unprompted. He was the kind of man who answered questions when asked, and otherwise kept to himself. Eugene asked him about that Tuesday afternoon, about what he had seen from his front porch, where he spent most of his afternoons in good weather. Harold thought about it for a while. He described a car, a green station wagon. he thought, or possibly dark blue. He remembered it because it had driven past 3 times in about an hour, which struck him as odd in that neighborhood. He had noticed a partial plate number without knowing why. The way people sometimes notice details that mean nothing at the time and everything later. He had never mentioned it because nobody had asked him specifically about that afternoon. Eugene wrote all of it down. He went home and he drew a map of the block from memory. He marked Harold's porch. He marked the sightlines. He marked where Sylvia's route would have taken her. He marked 3 other houses whose windows faced that stretch of street and began the process of finding out who had lived in them in October 1971. It took him 6 years. He worked in the evenings after his shift at the school. He worked on weekends. He worked with the methodical, unhurried patience of a man who had learned in a jungle that the thing you are looking for will reveal itself if you keep still long enough and keep your eyes open. In 1979, he wrote his conclusions section. He named a man who had lived in the county at that time, who had owned a vehicle matching Harold's description, whose movements Eugene had reconstructed through a combination of public records, conversations, and the kind of careful cross-referencing that produces certainty slowly and quietly over years. The man had died in 1986, but the name was there. The evidence was there. The chain of reasoning was precise and documented and complete. When FBI forensic investigators ran the case in 2019 using Eugene's file and modern DNA analysis, they confirmed his identification within 4 months. Sylvia Crane's mother was 83 years old. She was living in an assisted care facility in Columbus. An FBI victim advocate drove to see her in person. She had been waiting 48 years. 11 of the other 13 solved cases followed similar patterns. Different decades. Different victims. The same method. Eugene finding the witness nobody had found. Eugene asking the question nobody had thought to ask. Eugene writing it all down with the same clear handwriting and the same patient thoroughness and the same complete absence of any interest in whether anyone would ever read it. The remaining 3 solved cases were different. In those cases, Eugene had not found witnesses. He had found evidence. Physical evidence that had either been overlooked at the time or had become available later as the city changed. Buildings were demolished. Land was cleared. He had collected it carefully, documented its location and context, preserved it correctly, and written precise chain of custody notes explaining where it came from and when and under what circumstances he had found it. The FBI forensic team that reviewed his evidence collection methods said that his technique was correct. Not approximately correct. Correct. The methods he used to collect and preserve physical evidence matched current best practice. When asked where a retired janitor with a 6th grade education had learned forensic evidence handling, the answer eventually found in the basement was a shelf of textbooks. Forensic science, criminal investigation procedure, evidence law, DNA analysis for non-specialists, all of them read carefully, their margins full of notes in Eugene's handwriting, some pages marked with small tabs where he had noted something important. He had taught himself. Over 40 years, working alone in a basement, he had built the skills he needed to do the work he had decided needed doing. Nobody had asked him to do it. Nobody had known he was doing it. Nobody had told him it was his responsibility or his right or within any authority he possessed. He had simply looked at a 9-year-old girl's photograph in a newspaper in 1971 and decided that someone should keep looking, and that someone was going to be him. There was one more thing in the basement. On the shelf nearest the door, at eye level, where it would be the first thing anyone saw when they came in, there was a single photograph in a plain frame. It showed a young man in marine dress uniform. He was maybe 20 years old. He was standing very straight and looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something close to it. On the back of the frame, in Eugene's handwriting, were 4 words. Pay attention. Do something. Agent Kowalski took a photograph of it. She kept it on her desk for the rest of her career. The Dayton Police Department formally acknowledged Eugene Marr's work in a press conference 6 months after the basement was discovered. The chief of police said that Eugene had contributed more to the resolution of cold cases in Montgomery County than any single investigator in the department's history. He said that statement was not hyperbole. He said he wanted to be clear about what had been accomplished by a man who swept floors for a living and asked nothing from anyone and left no instructions about what to do with any of it when he was gone. Several journalists wrote about Eugene after the press conference. They tried to find people who had known him well enough to explain him. What they found were teachers who remembered a man who fixed things quietly, students who remembered a man who saw them, neighbors who remembered a man who shoveled their walks in winter without being asked, a woman at the VA who said he came in once a year for his annual checkup and always brought a small plant for the waiting room and never mentioned why. Nobody knew about the basement. Nobody knew about the files. Nobody knew about the 40 years of quiet work he had done for 47 families who did not know his name. That was the point. Eugene Marr understood something that most people spend their whole lives not quite understanding. He understood that the value of a thing is not determined by whether anyone is watching you do it. He had learned that in a jungle in Vietnam when he was 21 years old. He had learned it in the particular way that men learn things when the cost of forgetting is absolute. He had brought it home with him, and he had never put it down. He had swept floors for 38 years and solved cold cases in his basement and brought donuts on the last Friday of every month and remembered every child's name and shoveled his neighbor's walks. And he had done all of it with the same steadiness and the same silence and the same complete indifference to whether anyone would ever know. He was not trying to be a hero. He was trying to pay attention and do something. That was all. That has always been enough. There are 18 million veterans in this country. Most of them came home and built quiet lives. Most of them carried what they carried without making anyone watch them carry it. Most of them woke up every day in an ordinary house, in an ordinary town, and made ordinary decisions about how to spend the hours they had. Eugene Marr spent his hours on Sylvia Crane, on 46 other families who were still waiting, on third graders who needed someone to notice them, on neighbors who needed their walks cleared, on a school that needed its lights fixed before anyone realized they were flickering. He died with $4,200 in his savings account. He left behind 14 families who finally had answers. He left behind 38 years of children who had been seen by someone who meant it. He left behind a photograph in a plain frame with 4 words on the back. Pay attention. Do something. The rest of it he left to us.